There's a little preamble I'm supposed to read that says, "This presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as a part of a media assistant grant donated to my organization, the Missoula Art Museum, by MCAT. And for more information, you can visit mcat.org. Welcome, everybody. I'm Brandon Ranches, one of the curators here at MAM. And it's my pleasure to welcome not only Ryan Feddersen, but her family here to the Missoula Art Museum for, I don't know, the third time, I think. We've had a series of meetings over the past several years. Ryan initially came to the Missoula Art Museum as a person who contributed an artwork in the Terrain Plateau portfolio, and we started getting familiar with her artwork then, and then she had another piece in a traveling exhibition that was circulated by the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture, and she had this really fantastic sculpture called Blade Descending Pedestal that was right in the center of the room where Ron's standing with the camera, and it was the piece in the exhibition that included artists from across the western half of the United States, mostly in the Northwest, but also the Southwest. And her piece was the piece that the whole exhibition kind of revolved around. The exhibition circumambulated your sculpture. So it was really incredible to see the impact that a single piece of sculpture could have on all the school children that come and visit us, the college classes, the general public. People really seemed to enjoy that piece. And prior to that, we had started talking to Ryan about what this exhibition might look like. We said, we're looking a couple years out, this is the space. We're really interested in the interactive nature of your work and how you really involve us as viewers into the interpretation, creation of your work. And so we said we'd like to think about that. If you would consider works, and she said, well, these are the works that I've done in the past, and this is what I'm working on now, and this is what I might make. And so as we began that discussion, this exhibition evolved to include the 4 pieces that you see around the room, and we picked 4 succinct pieces that dealt with land use and development, from a historical all the way through a contemporary perspective, and just caused us to kind of reevaluate what some of our assumptions were. And it was really an exciting exhibition because the work was being made right up to the last minute, and still is being made, as you can see, right up to the last minute. So it's an evolving concept, and it's been a really wonderful thing to have such a healthy exhibition at the center of the museum. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan, and what we envisioned this as. Julie Kajun was not able to make it with us this morning. She ended up being stuck in Idaho, unfortunately. She sent a good friend here, Tammy. But instead of having this kind of be as like a dialogue, well, no, it's still a dialogue. Let's not throw that out. Rather than have this be a conversation that we observe from a distance, let's make this a conversation between all of us here. And if you have questions or comments about the work as Ryan's explaining it, or if you have something to contribute from a theoretical or philosophical or practical aspect, just chime up and throw it at her. She's really good with curveballs, so you can try to knock her off her feet, but I'll be surprised if you succeed. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ryan Feddersen. Thanks for coming, Ryan.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure working with you over this past, I think, maybe year and a half as we started talking about this exhibition. And I'm really excited about how everything came together and the way we were able to pull from existing themes and work and kind of transform some of my existing work in the space. So I'm Ryan Feddersen. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. I grew up in Wenatchee, Washington. And my practice centers around interactive installation art. And I also think a lot about the way that action, interactivity, and the materiality, specifically the connotations of materials, can support content in a work. I'm always looking to build that with each new work, which is why you'll see different types of materials and different types of action and interactivity in all the works that are here today. And that focus really goes back to two things. One is the way that I've always felt that when you're making an artwork, you are having a meditation on that subject. No matter how much you think you know about something, when you put in sometimes hundreds of hours thinking about, looking at, and building, you begin to know a lot more about how you feel about that. You understand more about how your ideas were constructed. And I like to give the opportunity for the audience to have some of that experience as opposed to of a passive looking at an image and interpreting its content, having that access point of helping to build that content through your touch, through your participation. And I also, it's based on inspiration from my first Indigenous art history class at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I spent one semester there, and on the very first day of class, the instructor, the late Ed Wap, the first thing he said is he informed us that there was no word for art in any Indigenous language, no word that had the exact translation. And we're all there for our arts, it's an art college. We're all like, well, what are you saying we're doing here? Like, this is what we want to do with our lives, and you're telling us like that's not of an Indigenous tradition. But what he really wanted us to think about was that there is a Western idea of what art is. And that is, it's usually an object made by a trained, talented, special person that you get to look at. It's on a pedestal, you don't get to touch it. It's on the wall, you don't get to touch it. You may have to pay admission to see it. It's for collectors. It's for institution of power. It's for governments. It's for churches. And that practice was not in Indigenous cultures. Art was made to be used. It was made to be touched. It was made to have experiences. It was made to be worn. It was made for communities to talk to each other and to reflect like their culture and values. And that really had a profound effect on the way that I wanted to make art. I always knew that I wanted to like communicate ideas and try and like do social critique and instigate change through the work that I was doing. But it really made it a very direct way of thinking about like what are my goals, what are my priorities, and what are the tools that I can use to really approach that. And for me, one of the things that really resonated about that was the interactivity. That the art isn't something just for outside of you, it's something that you actually get to touch and you actually get to participate in. And so these works in the gallery all kind of show that in different ways. Can I see how many people? Well, I guess we're on video, so it doesn't really matter how many people were here last night. So I'll start kind of going through some of the works. The first work I'll talk about is the Martha Stewart cocktails. That is based on one of the oldest works in this exhibition. It is a new installation of a previous concept, which I was really excited about the opportunity to really expand upon that prior idea. But this was developed when I was still in college, and I was thinking a lot about connotations of materials, and the both with like the felt makes you think about softness and warmth and femininity, but the act of felting itself is a very feminine activity. And there's often this idea that when something is so heavily feminized, it becomes then devalued as an art object. And I wanted to kind of disrupt that. And the way I thought about that was disrupting it by pairing it with violence. And so I started with the felt and started to make this this Molotov cocktail explosion. And in this installation, it's installed in stages. So we see from the first lighting all the way through to the splash of fire on the wall. And I think this piece became exceptionally relevant again with our recent political climate and the level of misogyny that was kind of hurled at women during this last year. So I kind of see that work as being a little bit in tribute to all the women who want to stay nasty, keep fighting, but also be lifting up their ideas about femininity along with that there doesn't have to be this contrast between the feminine and the powerful, or the women's craft or art object. The piece directly behind us is Disconnected Towers, and this piece has been reinstalled with new elements. And this is one of probably the last minutes. I kind of got inspired on my last visit, and I told Brandon, by the way, I really want to install something, a new piece behind this work to really put it into a different context. I live in a neighborhood in Seattle that has experienced a tremendous amount of change and gentrification in the last several years. And if a house is being torn down but is not changing zone, there's no notices that are put up. There's no public land use, it just comes down. But so I started to notice these giant wooden towers on front lawns. And I thought that they were ominous and almost religious. It almost looked like they were going to tack a witch to it and light it up. And it was just like these haphazard wooden sculptures. And then over time I started to notice that the house would then come down. And I realized that they were tying off the electricity of one home so they could hold it while they demolished it, and then often put in maybe like 4 $500,000 condos in the place of what had been one affordable single-family home. And so this was rapidly changing the nature of the neighborhood that I lived in. And I started to see these towers as these warnings or beacons of change. And then, so in this piece, it was actually first installed with the city of Seattle. It was kind of this great irony. The Office of Arts and Culture was commissioning a work in their gallery space that was criticizing the practices of this unchecked development where these are all being signed off by the offices in that building. And it started with one, which was the asterisk, the idea of like the unknown, something else is coming next. And then over the span of a couple of weeks, they built, and like more and more icons came up, and we have references to like stocks raising and greed and inequality and religion. And as I was thinking about this piece in the context of Montana, like outside of where I'm from and like our dialogue, I realized that it still had a lot of relevance here, and its relevance actually stretched through more time, which is why I've included I think it's about a 7-foot tower of buffalo skulls that you see through the piece to think about tying together a history. There were over 300 million buffalo in the Plains region, and 270 million were slaughtered for the sole purposes of Western expansion. They were slaughtered to starve out native populations, to make their traditional ways of living unsustainable, and to make way for the railroad systems. And thinking about the way people see a space that someone else has that they want, decide that the people there are no longer worthy of that space, they're going to remove them and replace them with a new community, is something that has been continuous in our colonial history. And I wanted this piece to really draw together part of that trajectory. The next piece is the Unveiling the Romantic West. And these 5 panels are, they're essentially black and white replicas of the Paxa murals that are at the Missoula County Courthouse. This piece was developed for the MAM in conversation, like kind of like looking back at some of the works that I'd done, looking at reinterpreting art historical work with a critical lens attached to it. And when we first started talking about this work, I thought there was a really great opportunity to start to dismantle and look at some of these very romantic, one-sided depictions of Western expansion. Now, these panels depict approximately 90 years of history from, I think, did we do chronological? No, actually, we mimicked the installation in the courthouse. So the first image is of Lewis and Clark encountering the Salish people. In this representation, the Salish have come across Lewis and Clark's encampment. However, the records suggest the opposite. The land, there are first-person accounts that have been passed down through the Salish tribe that are recorded in a book that they put out that talks about the space where this first interaction took place would have been being used for processing like choke cherries and roots. And so there would have been thousands of people encamped in this space, and eight stragglers wandered up to them, looking lost, disheveled, undersupplied, and so they offered, believing them to be a defeated war party, they offered them food, clothing, all kinds of gifts to help them through their trial as they saw that interaction. They were not aware that they were sent by the Hudson Bay Company as a scouting crew to find lands and resources to exploit. In the panel to its left, we have Lewis and Clark fording the river as they're about to leave. So within these images, I'm using a process with thermochromic ink. And so while I've on the surface replicated the packs and murals faithfully, hidden within some of the larger black areas are additional commentary and details on the histories depicted in these panels. And so in the fording of the river, if you place your hand in the back trees, you'll see some roads and buffalo, because this was one of the historic access points to hunting. They called it the Buffalo Road. Underneath Meriwether's hand, you'll see a depiction of a fetus because they left behind babies. So there are direct descendants from Clark in the Salish Kootenai tribe, who also kept his last name, and as well as some depictions of the plants that would have been gathered in that region, and some references to the opium that the expedition brought with them. During one of the things I looked at to kind of explore more of these histories was also the journals of Lewis and Clark. So they talked, there's a lot of written about this day and how miserable they all were from the mosquitoes, and people were really sick and uncomfortable. And so at night they all did a bunch of opium to feel better. But it's an interesting detail on like the things that they brought with them. So we have the contrast of the bitter root flowers on one side, and you can unveil like the poppies across on the other. And then I think the next we have chronologically is their first meeting with Ravelli, and he's negotiating a location for the mission. And so hidden within this image of these men meeting are details about what they thought about each other. In the Salish Kootenai's accounts in the book that I was mentioning earlier, they talked about there being a lot of openness to accept new religious practices. However, the misunderstanding was that they were expected to abandon their own and revelli, as opposed to respecting and wanting to enlighten them, considered them satanic. And so there are different cues to those kinds of hidden and future conflicts hidden within that piece. Our second to last chronological piece is the square piece behind, which depicts the Hell's Gate Treaty. And within this piece, we have references to the treaty rights that were covered, that are hidden within the canopy of the trees, as well as references to documented parts of their conversation, where when some of the tribal leaders did not want to sign, they thought that calling him a dog and a woman and threatening him would get him to comply. There was not the records of translation was that it was very poor and there was a lot of miscommunication. So he probably didn't know what he was being called names, but he was being screamed at. Not everyone signed, and later the final signature was forged. We also have in this picture Coyote hiding in the trees, the figure of mischief kind of watching in the background. And our last panel is depicting the Salus expulsion from the Bitterroot Valley. And in this depiction, we see like the men charging on horseback, the youth kind of celebrating in the background. They have their arms raised and they're playing on their ponies. However, there were few horses, and something that is omitted from this original image, but you can find in a layer under the bushes on the left side, is the armed guard escort that was forcing them from the valley. You can also erase the celebrating youth and uncover the location, which is current Stevens Avenue. And then we also have references to the bison in this piece as well, as this space was being cleared out of bison for the railroad. And then the last piece I'm going to talk a little bit about is the Coyote Now series, which is behind us. This series was inspired as I was reading Mourning Dove's records of traditional coyote stories from the Kettle Falls. She is a kind of a recorder of stories from Plateau lore from the region of my tribal affiliation. And as I was reading through her collection of coyote stories, there was also, I became fascinated with the annotations. I was so excited about reading these like footnotes. And there's really interesting things, including this idea that while there are ritualized coyote stories that are told the same way and are told at certain times of year, special occasions, there are also ones that are intended to be told like live and in the moment. And so there are records of early stories where Coyote is preparing moss that he uses a microwave oven, because that's what people at the time they were no longer needing to make pit fires to process. They had microwaves. And so Coyote was keeping up with this for a certain period of time. And that idea of telling a story in the now was something that really resonated with me. And it made me think about, well, if Coyote, the way that Coyote functioned in these stories as he's explaining the world, and like kind of like that value of what you can get from imaginative storytelling outside of purely scientific or fact-based storytelling is really rich, and it can really put a mirror on us. And Coyote, as a figure of mischief, often models mistakes so that he can experience the consequences and we can attempt to choose better for ourselves. And so I started thinking in that context, what has Coyote been up to since we last heard about him learning about microwaves till now? And so I thought about these things that sometimes we question our responsibility on. And so in this panel, we have Coyote is in the sweat lodge, and he has bribed his frenemy the mouse to bring his hot rocks. They bring in the hot rock and they take a slice of cheese. And he gets really hot and he decides he's done. But the system that he set up to feed his greedy desire, it doesn't go away when he decides that he doesn't need anymore, that he's done. The rocks continue to come and come. And so in the last panel, we have the newscaster telling us that temperatures are continuing to rise. Scientists are baffled by persistent global warming. So there's the question on climate change and is it our doing? And we're kind of looking at some of the behaviors Coyote exhibits that mirror our industrial practices. And he gets to reflect our feelings of responsibility. Similarly, in the last panel, we have Coyote fighting with his wife, the mole, who knows why they married, but they don't particularly get along. They're fighting, she's running away, he tries to kill her pretty often. In the participation, we can see that they maybe have different political views. But they get into a fight, and he goes after her, and she starts tunneling. And she's tunneling and tunneling. Every time she comes out, he's there leaping after her again. And eventually, all of that undermining of the ground causes a massive sinkhole. So maybe it's not fracking. Maybe that's not making the sinkholes like they say. Maybe it's just Coyote and Mole in a really epic battle. And then we also have a few more, a little simpler personal stories. Got Coyote addicted to technology. This is maybe me a little reflecting myself. He on his commute, he's got his laptop and headphones on his computer all throughout his workday. His frenemy the mouse is turning back the clock. A little nod to their relationship there. And then even in bed, he's still on the computer, but he's starting to think about, you can tell from his reading materials, he's starting to think about trying to get away from it. He just really wants to reconnect with nature. But in the end, we see him on his camping trip, but it's set aside for now, but he still has his iPad. And then the first piece was developed for the Missoula Art Museum as well. And I was looking at kind of some mysteries in Missoula's history and thinking like, if Coyote was busy here, what are some of the things that he could have had his hand in? And so here I've imagined Coyote as an artist. He's anti-war, pretty serious political artist. That's why he has a beret. And he's plotting what he's going to do, how he's going to use his art to talk about that. And you see him get the idea. The peace signs are reflected in his eyes. He's got his plan. We see him clandestinely graffitiing at night. And in the last slide, we have Coyote making the infamous peace sign. And then part of the interactivity of this piece is also based on another specific anecdote from Mourning Dove's descriptions of Coyote, and which is that Coyote is immortal. A full Coyote epic is to begin with his resurrection and end with his death. Now, because he gets in so much trouble, it's inevitable he's gonna bite the dust sometimes, which is why he has the ability to be, if any scrap of fur or bone or whisker survives, that he can be brought back. And so I wanted to think about that method of his immortality, the remains, as being a metaphor. And so paired with these vignettes, we have crayons cast into the shape of coyote bones. And so we're thinking about creativity as being the way that he becomes immortal. As long as we're continuing to create with Coyote, and as long as we're continuing to create his adventures, that he cannot die. And so I think that kind of covers like the ideas presented in these works. Is there any questions or anything anyone wants to share from their responses?
Could you talk a little bit about the Hudson Bay Company? Because, of course, I grew up on the thing about Jefferson and how excited he was to have the Lewis and Clark expedition and so forth. And how did that?
Yeah. One of the things I really wanted to look at within addressing these pieces is that there is one history and one narrative that is taught. And I was taught, as many school children were, that this was an expedition of discovery, that the purpose was to find out how things connected, what was out there, how do we get to the water, and to find these ways of crossing this space. And I was never taught that this was a commercial expedition that was for the sole purpose of finding resources to take, and that this was that these were not explorers, Lewis and Clark. They were company men, and they had very specific goals in mind with that expedition, and they were reporting back, and that the treaties that followed to take these resource-rich lands were in direct connection to their initial goals, and that those things, while presented as being very separate in this master narrative, were actually very, very linear and planned in conjunction with each other. So that's why I really wanted to bring in multiple references to the Hudson Bay Company. And in the last slide, we have Lolo Mountain, which the Hudson Bay Company named. And so I've also plastered their logo on the side of the mountain as a reference to their claim as well.
Why don't you show some of them so they can see how it works? What? Sorry.
You're tethered.
Okay. I have really cold hands, so I might need help from someone who's a little warmer. Here. I do have freezing hands. There's someone who tends to have warm hands. Goes over. I'll follow my own instructions and hold my hand for 5 seconds. So Brandon is uncovering the stack of buffalo skulls that is kind of looming over the party as they're being expelled from the valley. And so in these spaces, like you can kind of see freezing hand. It'll work. I've got really warm hands. You can kind of find the spaces by looking. I guess you have much warmer hands. You can find the spaces by looking for like the matte texture. So,
Is this the armed escort?
no, that is actually a reference to the reenactment.
There's the,
Oh, yeah.
oh, yes.
Yeah, we've got the Hudson Bay Company logo there. That is a reference to the reenactment of the march. So this was a 51-mile forced march that took place over 3 days, with women and children on foot. The horses are not an accurate depiction, nor is it an accurate depiction of the carts, because they were told to leave everything, and that everything was set up on the other side, which was, of course, something that you tell somebody when you want them to march 51 miles somewhere else. That was not the case. And so yeah, so you're uncovering the railroads, which was a huge factor on why it was so important for people to be removed was the motivation was tied directly to the railroads. And Brandon's about to uncover some maps that show traditional territories paired with reservation lines over the top.
How did you discover this cave?
So
It's just the coolest stuff.
my first, the first time I ever saw this material was it was actually being used on an album. So it was a box set, and I think it was Massive Attack,
Wow.
and it was from the 80s or 90s, and you touch it and your hands would show. It's used in a variety of some commercial purposes. The company I got this from uses it on motorcycle gear, and they actually were really excited that it was going to be used for an art project, and they worked with me to develop this very specific temperature. It was hard for me to test because I have ice cold hands.
Oh my God.
So it was, yeah, it was Tyvek.
Yeah.
So it's very sensitive to what temperature so these actually activate at 71.6 degrees. And so we're in a climate controlled room, so that works.
But in Florida, it would be.
In Florida, it would be clear all the time.
There all the time.
Yeah, unless it was in like constant air conditioning.
Lights on it, or use a hair dryer.
Yeah, I did a piece recently where I was redacting a map of all of the Indian boarding schools in the U.S. And as I was placing them to map them, I had a hair dryer. And I was like, to
Takes the
find the
celebration out
names.
of it.
Yep.
The historic Paxton home is also on Stevens Avenue.
Oh, is that really?
Oh, that's right.
So when I initially saw this, I hadn't realized that the route of the extraction was across Stevens.
So it's shocking to me how this romantic image has been superimposed over the reality, because we actually have first the eyewitness testimonies of what this really looked like, and how deplorable and how abused the individuals were who were making this journey. So it's really, to walk by it in the courthouse every day is
Yeah.
one thing,
Have people
and to see that,
celebrating.
and I love how you've superimposed the reality check, but how it's also the same way it was in the treaty signing. It was hidden. Everything in the treaty signing was hidden in so many ways. There were so many ways it was deceptive on multiple levels, including the survey that was never conducted.
And then later, the same.
It's fascinating, beautiful.
I don't think so.
You mentioned a book yesterday at the courthouse, and I didn't get it. The name
It's
of
the Salish people and the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Okay.
And so when working on this project, I looked at both the courthouse's commissioned essays on like what the content was in each of these pieces, and then I dug into other sources. So that book was one of my primary sources for records of like what the additional histories from an indigenous perspective on like what was happening in these snippets of history, like what are the things that are being excluded from this narrative. And that book also is very interested in thinking in a span of time. So a lot of times people consider history contact, and then there's prehistory before that, and it's like, well, we're just not going to talk about that. But there's, before like that, the point of that contact, there's 30,000 years of historic use of this space. And so these spaces weren't just, they had identities and purposes and cultural practices and food practices all existing within the space prior to these singular events that are being depicted. So I wanted to include references to those as well. And then I also looked at Lewis and Clark's actual diaries, because I was able to find, for several of these, I was able to find records from the day and compare their perspectives to the oral histories that have been recorded by the Salish people, and also to just add some things that that Paxton didn't include from their records. And I also used the mission's website and their history of Ravelli to add details about his personal life in that depiction as well.
You know, I also found it interesting too, I don't know if anyone else did, but I think when you were installing and giving a talk, you were talking about the different the different generations depicted between the pieces. I certainly found that really interesting too.
Yeah, so these are depicting approximately 90 years of history, and there are multiple generations of tribal leadership depicted within them. And so in the first one, 3 eagles was present, and then in the treaty, it's Chief Victor, and then in the expulsion, it's his son, Chief Charlo. And I saw records that there was much more conversation about Victor and Charlo, like Victor being Charlo's father. But in one of my references, I saw that the 3 eagle was Victor's father. So it'd be 3 generations.
Ryan, I'm curious, did you come to interactivity as a strategy fairly early on when you were starting to make art? And do you see the pieces that you're doing in the public sphere, like murals and public pieces, as even though they're not strictly interactive as the pieces, do you feel like that's an extension of that interactivity?
I do. So before working with direct interactivity, I started working with action. And sometimes that action would be completed by me. And so I think the first one, I made a large wall installation on domestic violence that mimicked Sudoku. And instead of using numbers, I printed out images of domestication, oppression, and submission, and then organized them in a way that both replicated like flesh and a body in its coloring, but also a Sudoku board with all of the symbols. And so in that case, I enacted putting together that piece as I installed it. And then as I continued to think about materiality and action as supporting content, I started to open that to participation from the audience. And I think the first piece that really reflects the way I use interactivity now was my BFA thesis piece, which was A Little Color in the White House. And it was made, as you might imagine, during the run-up to the 2008 election. And it actually, I was making it during the election, and it was exhibited after the inauguration. And it was a 3/4 scale replica of the White House State Dining Room. And it was from like everything, as many details as I could find, from like the drapes, the pattern on the drapes, to the crown molding used, and paintings in the room were all replicated as a coloring book. And then I cast a feast in crayon. And the feast was comprised of both delicacies like oysters and roast meats, but also like some down home, just like chopped carrots and beans. And some of them had bites taken out of them. Some of them had mold growing on them. And
Were they cast crayon as well?
yeah, they were all in cast crayon.
I remember that piece.
Kids did try to eat them. But so they were set across the table, and then the audience was invited to color in the piece. And it was a feast of leftovers. And I was kind of thinking about like the mess left behind, and the invitation to think about yourself as having the potential to be an actor in your government and in your space. And it was also a question of like, what were then people going to do? Were they going to color in the piece as a coloring book? Were they going to tag it? Were they going to use it as a political forum, as you see happening with the coyote pieces? And so a lot of the interactivity in art there was like what the audience then did with that space. And
That's something we've really struggled with here at the Missoula Art Museum, is the unpredictability of what you, as the creators of this piece or these pieces, are going to do. And we've seen all sorts of really interesting ways that people interact, and sometimes we've kind of tried to figure out a way to guide people for appropriate ways of touching, so that they're not rubbing and doing slapping. We've seen a lot of slapping and rubbing, things like that. So it's really that idea of audience unpredictability, visitor unpredictability. They've got something to say and they're going to figure out how to say it the best way that they can. Has been a really interesting evolution, and I'm wondering, how do you deal with that? How do you can't really account for it necessarily.
So I'll give you an example of one of the ways I've dealt with it.
Okay.
This piece, the first iteration, was hand drawn, and it was hard. It was heartbreaking. Actually the little color in the White House, that was hand drawn over. It was hand inked over. I had printed out like the kind of like outlines of it. The next piece was purely hand drawn, and I was like, I am never doing that again, because even though I knew better, I started to hope that they turned out pretty. And I was like, I'm like so excited to see like how beautiful, because they were so beautiful as just drawings. I was like, I'm so excited to see how beautiful they're going to be.
They have such potential.
And when you invite in a public, you never know what that process is going to be. And I always now think of my interactive works as being consumable. And we kind of discussed that with these pieces, and as we were planning how we were our business relationship on these pieces, and is that they are made for this, and it is completely possible that they will be totally consumed by this event. And so these pieces are all cut vinyl on mat board, so they are reproducible, easily reproducible. They're all in files on my computer. I can entirely let go and not have any expectations about what they're going to look like at the end. There are some right now that I very much love how they're turning out, but I also understand that like when I collect them in a couple more months, that's probably not going to be the case anymore.
You have to stay detached.
But it's also back to that idea about like indigenous methodology on art making, is that it's not the product that is the art. It's not this like special beautiful thing that you get to look at or collect. It is what it is doing in a community and cultural space. And so it's okay that they don't live forever, that they might get destroyed, because their purpose is in being with people and being participated with people. It's not in making a thing.
Can you imagine what you do to the curators?
Yeah.
What is the paper that you've drawn on here?
So these are on Tyvek. So very much in line with talking about a piece that is intended, that I was aware that people might be pushing and scratching. Tyvek is traditionally used to cover buildings to protect them from weather while they're being constructed.
Oh, and you see it written on the...
Yeah. Or in very strong envelope material. And so you can order it blank from them. And so this is a very sturdy paper-like, fabric-like material that's made from like composite plastic. And theoretically, I mean, the crayons were a little hard to remove, but I also imagine like not all hands are going to be clean. This material can then also be washed.
Sometimes they make shower curtains out of it too, because it's very water resistant.
And hiking gear and those overalls you buy when you want to paint in your house and not get anything on your clothes, those are all Tyvek as well.
But Ryan's use of it as a building material, I think, is almost an extension off of the disconnected towers, and kind of some sort of a commentary on land use and development, kind of, but very subtly. Unless you know it's a building material, those associations don't present themselves.
So that's Tyvek?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a comment?
So I had a question. I've been grappling lately in my conversations with Julie with cultural value of reciprocity. And when I see your installations, I see manifestations of that. Could you talk about the degree to which the people who interact with your work are co-authors, and there's a give and take that occurs in the process?
Yeah, so all of the work I make is very direct and deliberate in its purpose. The interactivity and the layered meanings and metaphors are intended to invite people to think about a subject, particularly things that involve cognitive dissonance. And you know, I spent my younger years making some maybe more abrupt or confrontational works, and I feel like in order for people to actually make a personal decision or change, that it needs to come from them and not from me telling them. And so I see myself as making opportunities for other people to think about things. And I don't need them to co-author or necessarily reciprocate unless they're helping complete a metaphor. In the case of some of the public artworks I've done, the participation becomes very important to that. But I like to think that I'm providing something and not necessarily doing something in order to make a reciprocal relationship.
So they're not really co-artists.
Yeah. I'm more formatting an experience that I'm offering.
They have a chance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
I don't even need to think about it.
Well, that's probably a good note to end on. We've come to our noon hour, and Ryan is getting ready for an afternoon workshop. So I just wanted to thank you all for coming and participating in this conversation. And can we thank Ryan for coming from Seattle and presenting her artwork?
Thank you.